we are going to study our new topic about the economic growth. The first part of the economic growth in this chapter about the capital accumulation and the population growth, and we will continue at the next chapter, inshallah. Also, the second part of the economic growth. Let's take a look about what we studied till now. We are going to start a new part. Okay, as you know, we take as the first part an introduction about macroeconomics, the main indicators, the GDP, the inflation rate, and the unemployment rate, and how to use data and models in macroeconomics. Then we just finished the second part of the classical theory. We studied the economy in the long run. We studied the national income, where it comes from and where it goes, and the monetary system, what is it and how it works, and also we studied the inflation, its causes and effects, and its social costs, and then the open economy, and finally we just finished the unemployment and the labor force, labor market chapter. Today we are going to start the third part of our course about the growth theory. The growth theory deals with the economy in the very long run. So we just finished the classical theory, the economy in the long run. Now we will start the growth theory, the economy in the very long run. We will study just two chapters about the economic growth. First, about the capital accumulation and population growth, and the second is the technology, empirics, and policy, and how it affects the economic growth. Then next month, inshallah, we will finish our course by the fourth part about the business cycle theory, which deals with the economy in the short run. So let's start part 3 today with this chapter about the economic growth. We will see in this chapter the solo model about the closed economy, how the country's standard of living depends on saving and the population growth rates of this country. Imagine if you are like a family or household and so on, the standard of living of this family depends on how much they save from their income and how many children they have and so on. So all these factors affect the standard of living of this family. Also, the countries and the economies are the same thing. Then we will see in the next lesson how to use the golden rule to find the optimal saving rate and capital stock. So, why the growth is important? We will see now some examples about the standard of living in many countries. You can see that 1/4 of the poorest countries have famines during the past 3 decades, as poverty is associated with oppression of women and minorities. So the economic growth raises the living standards and reduces the poverty. According to this schedule, you can see here the international differences in the standard of living. In a country, for example, like United States, you can see the income per person is about $51,000 per year, but a country like Ethiopia, it's only $1,240 income per person. So the economic growth important because it raises the living standards and reduces the poverty. And we can see here from this chart the income and poverty in the world selected countries. As you can see, the percentage of the population living on $2 per day or less. You can see here about in Madagascar, مثلا, above, you can see more than about 90% of population living on $2 per day, and the same thing in the horizontal axis, the income per capita in dollars, it is lower. So when the income uh, decreases, like in the case in Madagascar, India, Nepal, Kenya, and so on, so you can see the relation here. So now we can see how why the growth is important, as anything that affects the long run rate of economic growth, even by a tiny amount, will have huge effect on the living standard in the long run. Anything affects the long run rate of the economic growth will affect the standard of living on the long run. We can see here, for example, the annual growth rate of income per person. If it is the annual growth rate is 2%, so the percentage increase in the standard of living after 25 years will be 64%. If the annual growth rate is 2.5%, so the percentage increase in the standard of living will be 85%. So you can see a small amount of increasing in the annual growth rate affects the percentage increase in the standard of living in a huge amount. So if the annual growth rate of the United States, for example, real GDP per capita had been just 1/10 of 1% higher during the 90s, and the US would have generated an additional $496 billion of income during that decade. So it can make a positive difference in the lives of hundreds of millions of people. These lessons help us to understand why the poor countries are poor, and is how to design policies that can help them to grow. And also we'll learn how our own growth rate is affected by shocks and the government's policies. First topic in this chapter, the accumulation of capital, the solo model. We have three topics. We will start with this topic today, and the two topics in this chapter will be next lesson, inshallah. So, due to the scientist Robert Solow, a Nobel Prize winner, contribution to the study of the economic growth, there is a major paradigm about the widely used in the policy making, the theory, and its benchmark against which most recent growth theories are compared, and looks at the determinants of economic growth and the standard of living in the long run. So, in short, the solo growth model is designed to show how growth in capital stock, growth in the labor force, and advances in technology interact in an economy, as well as how they affect a nation's total output of goods and services. So we will build this model in a series of steps. Our first step is to examine how the supply and demand for goods determine the accumulation of capital. In this first step, we assume that the labor force and technology are fixed. Then we relax these assumptions by introducing changes in the labor force later in this chapter, and by introducing changes in the next chapter, as we said. Just I want to be sure from the voice, the audio. Okay. So, how the solo model is different from what we studied in chapter 3 model. Now the capital is no longer fixed, as the investment causes it to grow and depreciation causes it to shrink. Also, the labor is no longer fixed, as the population growth causes it to grow, and the consumption function is a more simple. Also, we don't have government spending or taxes. Only to simplify the presentation, we can still do fiscal policy experiments. And finally, there's some cosmetic differences. And the cosmetic differences include things like the notation, the lowercase letters for example, per worker. And we talk about capital, K capital for capital, Now we'll see K small for capital per person or so, instead of the uppercase letters of the aggregate magnitude and the variables that are measured on the axis of the main graph. So we can see here first the production function. In the aggregate terms, we know that the output is the function of the capital and the labor. We can see here the Y small and notation, which is the output per worker. So it is Y capital divided by L capital, the output divided by the labor. So it is the Y small, the output per worker, and also K small is the capital per worker, the K divided by L. So for any positive number, we can see here, assume constant returns to scale. If you remember the constant return to scale. So we have here Z for the any positive number more than 0. Z. So if we have Z Y, so it will be the function of Z K and Z L for any positive number. The refers, that is, if both capital and labor are multiplied by Z, so the amount of output is also multiplied by Z. And when the labor or capital increases by the amount of Z or any positive number, so the amount of the output, as according to the constant returns to scale, were also multiplied by Z. So this equation here shows that the amount of output per worker, output divided by the labor, is a function of the amount of the capital per worker, the capital divided by the labor. The number 1 here is constant and thus can be ignored. Okay, so we can see here in this curve, in the vertical axis, the output per worker, Y small, and the capital per worker, the K small. This production function exhibits diminishing the marginal production of capital, as the production function shows how the amount of capital per worker, K small, determines the amount of output per worker, Y small. So Y small is a function of K small, or the output per worker is a function of the capital per worker. So the slope of the production function is the marginal product of capital, MPK. If K small increases by 1 unit, if the capital per worker in the horizontal axis increases by 1 unit, so the output per worker in the vertical axis will increase by MPK unit, or marginal product of capital. So the production function becomes flatter, as we can see from the curve, as K increases, indicating what? The diminishing marginal product of capital. So let's go back to the national income identity. We don't have government spending here, so Y, the output, equals the consumption plus the investment. And per worker terms, we can see here the Y small equals the C small plus invest, yani the output per worker equals the consumption per worker and plus the investment per worker, and so on, where C small equals the consumption divided by the labor, and investment also equals investment divided by the labor. So we saw the production function, now the consumption function. We have here S, the saving rate, the fraction of income that is saved, right? So S is the only lowercase variable that is not equal to its uppercase version divided by L. As a consumption function here will be consumption per worker equals 1 minus S saving multiplied by the output per worker. We can see here the relation between the saving and investment as we saw in chapter 3. The saving per worker equals the output per worker minus the consumption. As we know, we have output, then we will, or income, then we will consume, and the remaining will be the saving. Okay, so and as we see what is consumption according to this slide, the consumption function here per worker, we can see here that rearranging this equation, so the saving will be equal uh, the investment at the national income identity. Here rearranging it, so investment equals saving like in chapter 3 as we saw before, and using a result uh, above, the investment will be the S saving multiplied by the function of the capital. So the growth in the capital stock and the steady state at any moment, the capital stock is a key determinant of the economy's output, but the capital stock can change over time, and those changes can lead to economic growth. In particular, two forces influence the capital stock: investment and the depreciation. Investment, is expenditure on new plant and equipment, and it causes the capital stock to rise. Depreciation is the wearing out of old capital. The wearing out of old capital due to aging and use and so on, and it causes the capital stock to fall. So let's consider each of these forces in turn. We can see here from this chart the output per worker on the vertical axis and the capital per worker also. We have here the amount of capital per worker, and this amount is the investment, and this is the consumption C1. So we can see from this graph the output and the consumption and the investment, the relationship between all these. The saving rate, which is denoted by S, determines the allocation of output between consumption and investment. Again, the saving rate, the amount of the saving that we have, determines what? The allocation of output between consumption and investment, how much you consume and how much you will invest. So for any level of capital, K, output is the function of the capital per worker, and investment is, as you see, the savings and the capital per worker, and consumption is the function of the capital per worker minus the investment. So this figure illustrates how for any value of capital of worker, the amount of output is determined by the production function, and the allocation of output between consumption and investment is determined by the saving rate. Again, for any value of K of capital, the amount of output is determined by the production function, and the allocation of the output between the consumption and investment is determined by the saving rate. Okay, because we can see here the curve of the S is dividing the between the consumption and investment, so it determines the allocation of consumption and investment. And the output Y1 is determined by the FK, which is the production function. So this is investment. What about depreciation? When the equipment in the of our investment, or the equipment of our plants and so on, are so old or used too much or so on, so depreciation will denote by this Greek letter. It is the lower case of delta. the rate of depreciation. It is called the rate of depreciation, as which is the fraction of the capital stock that wears out each year. Wears out, I don't know how to explain wears out. It's like when you use something too much, so it will be useless, or you can't use it anymore, so it is wear out. So the fraction of the capital stock that wears out each period, this is the rate of depreciation. Okay, so we can here see in the vertical axis the depreciation per worker and the capital per worker. So we can see here the positive relationship. Now we can see the capital accumulation, the basic idea in it that investment increases the capital stock and depreciation reduces it. Okay, I think it is clear. Investment increases the capital stock and depreciation reduces it. So the change or delta change in capital stock equals the investment minus the depreciation, as we can see here. Delta K equals I minus the delta K. So since the investment equals the savings multiplied by the function of the capital, this becomes, as we can see here, the change in the capital stock will equal the investment minus the depreciation. So this is a solo model central equation, determines behavior of capital over time, which in turn determines the behavior of all the other endogenous variables because they all depend on the capital. For example, the income per person equals the which is the income equals the function of capital or the capital per worker and the consumption per person, as we can see 1 minus savings multiplied by the capital per worker. Now we can see the steady state. So we saw investment increases and depreciation decreases, the capital stock and so on. So in between there is equilibrium or steady state. How? So if investment is just enough to cover the depreciation, then the capital per worker will remain constant at this case. The change in the capital per worker will be zero. Yani there is no change. Not the capital will be zero, the change in the capital. There is no increase and so on. It will remain constant. So this occurs at one value of capital per worker denoted K star, which is called the steady state of capital stock. Steady state capital stock denoted by K star. We can see here the steady state on this graph, the investment and depreciation on the vertical axis and the capital per worker on the horizontal axis. This is the investment curve and this is the depreciation curve. You can now see the steady state where you can find it here. Yes, in this intersection between the two curves. Yes, this is K star, the steady state of capital stock. Okay, so if we have here K1, this is this amount of the investment here, and this amount is the depreciation. Okay, so the investment is more than the depreciation, and this amount is the delta K or the change in the capital. If we move to K2, we can see the difference. This is the amount of the investment and this is depreciation. We can see the change in capital is smaller. Then we can see here the as long as the K is less than K star, the capital is less than the steady case of capital stock, the investment will exceed the depreciation. Okay, and when we go back to K2 or K1 and so on, so K is less than K star, so this means that investment exceeds the depreciation, and K will continue to grow towards K star. So you can see here again in constant graph. This is the capital stock increases because the investment exceeds the depreciation, as we saw, and the in K1. Then we can see K2, the capital stock decrease because depreciation exceeds the investment. You can see the difference between the blue curve and the red curve for investment and depreciation. And in the middle, the intersection between the two curves, steady state level of capital per worker. So the steady state level of capital is the level at which the investment equals the depreciation, indicating that the amount of capital will not change over time. So below the K star or the steady state level of capital, investment exceeds the depreciation, so the capital stock grows, and above the steady state level of capital, investment is less than depreciation, so the capital stock shrinks. Finally, we can see the increase in the saving rate, how it affects this. An increase in the saving rates will raise the investments. Okay, you can see here the saving curve shifts upwards, so causing the capital to grow towards a new steady state. We can see here the new intersection between the S2 and uh, 2. So you can see the capital grows toward a new steady state. So it moves from K star 1 to K star 2. We can see here also as an increase in the saving rate raises the investments, and that causes the capital stock to grow toward a new steady state. So an increase in the saving rate implies that the amount of investment for any given capital stock is higher, and it therefore shifts the saving function upward at the initial steady state K star 1. Investment now exceeds the depreciation. The capital stock rises until the economy reaches a new steady state, which is K star 2, with more capital and output. So when the saving rate is higher, the steady state of the level of capital will be higher, and since the output is the capital, the production function, or the higher the steady state level of capital, the higher will be the steady state of the output. That the solo model here predicts that the uh, the solo model here predicts that countries with higher rates of saving and investment will have higher levels of capital and income per worker in the long run. This is, in short, what the solo model wants to say, or what he predicts, that countries that have higher rates of saving, and so they will have higher rate of investment, they will have higher levels of capital and higher rate of income per worker in the long run. This is the prediction. If this is true or not, we can see from some implications in the real economies. Like here, for example, international evidence on the investment rates and income per person. We can see here the income per person in many countries, the investment as percentage of the output. The high investment is associated with high income per person, as the solo model predicts. Okay, we can see here the linear relationship between the investments and the income, which which is true. Okay, Now we finished this topic today. We know about the solo model and how the savings and investments and so affects the standard of living and the income rate and so on. Next lesson, inshallah, we will finalize this chapter. We will talk about the golden rule, how to reach the optimal case, and how also the population growth affects the economic growth. So, see you, inshallah, next lesson. Goodbye and good luck.